What's up, creators? I hope you're doing well. Welcome back to my channel. I'm Fuentes. Today we're returning to the Edit-like series and we're going to try to replicate the style of Roldan Gilbuena. This style is really interesting and it was suggested by a couple of you guys in the comment section on previous videos. So again, if you have any videos that want me to make or styles that I want me to break down, put it down in the comment section and I'll check them out. So first of all, we're going to jump into Instagram and break down his style, check out what he does in the color grading department. Then we have that breakdown complete. We're going to jump into Lightroom, apply that knowledge into editing a photo and creating a preset out of it. So let's get to it. So creators, here we have Roldan's profile, Roldan Gilbuena, if you're going to go and follow him on Instagram and support him. And if you take a broader look at his feed, you can notice that his style is very consistent throughout the time. Independently, if he's shooting portraits, street photography, product photography, all of them are edited in exactly the same colors. So his style is very warm, as we can see, and it's contrasted by this aqua or midnight color in the shadows. And sometimes he goes for a style which is a bit more contrasty and punchy and saturated, and another times he draws it back so it's a bit diffused and a little less harsh. So we can basically create two variants on his style. Now, before we start dissecting what he does in Lightroom for the color grading, first of all, let's take a moment to appreciate what he does on field, because how he takes his images in his case is a great factor into the final result that we're looking at on screen. First of all, apertures. He shoots at wide apertures. Almost all of his photos are shot at 1.4 or 1.8. Now, shooting at wide or shooting at fast apertures will create a blurred out background, blurred out foreground, but also it will create a softer image. All of his images have this very soft, very cinematic look. Cinema cameras are a lot softer than photo cameras. But in this case, shooting at 1.4, you're gonna achieve a less contrasty, less sharp image, rather than if you're shooting at, let's say, f4 or f5.6, where you're going to have the peak performance of your lens in terms of contrast and sharpness. So right here, you can notice how all of these images are a bit soft. You can see how, yes, the eye isn't completely in focus, also the hand, but notice the borders of the jacket and the other eye, they're already starting to blur out and just reducing a bit of the sharpness in the borders of the subject. Second factor is that almost all of these images are shot with the diffusion filter screwed onto the lens. Now, a diffusion filter creates a halo effect around bright elements, but also it reduces the contrast in the blacks. And we can see it in this image in particular. Notice how the lights here in the market have this glow effect around them, and that's just a byproduct of the diffusion filter. Any bright spot is going to be a bit more soft and a bit more glowy, and also the blacks, notice how they're a bit faded out. That's just a diffusion filter into effect. So we have to keep in mind that he shoots with the diffusion filter, and in Lightroom we can try to replicate the effects of diffusion with the dehaze tool and the clarity tool, but it's going to be limited. Nothing will replace shooting with a diffusion filter on field. Lastly, another factor that we have to keep in mind that it isn't part of the photo is these types of lens flares that add to the cinematic effect. This lens flare or the sun flare at top left corner is completely artificial. So he's adding it in a lot of photos just to make them a bit more dramatic, but have to keep in mind that this is done not in Lightroom, but it's done in maybe in Photoshop or lens distortions or any other post-editing program. Why I'm saying this is artificial? Because if the sun is at this height, we should see a bit of reflection in the forehead of Roldan and his little boy over here, and also pay attention to the shadow in the sand. It's coming from a completely different direction to the sun or the flare that he added over here. So we always have to keep in mind that there are some elements that come into play that we cannot control, but we can also try to replicate. So we're going to focus down in color grading and try to replicate these effects the best we can. Okay, now let's jump into what he actually does in the color grading in Lightroom. First of all, talking about exposure and contrast, we can notice a very flat exposure. He always shoots in environments with very diffuse lights, whether it be in the studio, whether it be at golden hour, or in the shadow of the big city. So we're always going to have a very evenly lit situation. Now, talking about the exposure in Lightroom, notice how there's never a pure white in his images. The whites are always laid back just a bit, so we don't have any pure white. The same occurs with the highlights, but then the shadows, he raises them up quite a bit, so we have a lot of detail in dark parts of the image. Pay attention to right here in the ceiling in this car park. Notice how we can see all the detail in the railing and the tubes. Normally, if you're exposing to the cars in the background, this part would be completely contrasty and with basically no information. So he's raising the shadows. Also, he's raising the blacks. Notice how the blacks, well, we're never going to see any pure black in his images as well. The blacks are raised up, so they're a bit grayish. So all of this, we're going to do it in the basic corrections in conjunction with the tone curve. Now, in terms of color grading, he does a very dramatic edit. Right here, we can see how some colors are very saturated, very vibrant, like the oranges, the reds, the aquas, or the teals. But then other colors like the blues, the purples, the greens are all very desaturated. Right here, the water, where we don't have any blue in the water, the trees in the background are very desaturated, so we always have to keep that in mind. It's a very dramatic edit. So normally he doesn't shoot stuff that has a lot of greens, but right here we can see just a little glimpse on what he does. Notice how the darker greens are very desaturated, very cold, but then the warmer greens in the grass in the background, they're very desaturated, but tending towards the yellowish tones. So we're not having any natural greens in the image. Now, the thing that really stands out about his style is that he's creating a very bicolor palette. Right here, we can see a clear difference between the warmer tones and the teals. Notice how the reds, the oranges, and the yellows are very similar to each other. The same thing occurs with the blues, the aquas, and the mints. All of these colors are also very similar to each other, and it basically creates this bicolor image. And this is done creating color palettes or homologated palettes in camera calibration. So in camera calibration, he's basically creating this palette where he's changing all the tones to either to the oranges or either to the teals. Now, the problem with messing around with camera calibration is that he also messes around with the oranges and the yellows in the skin. And therefore, all of the subjects, as we can see, the skin tones are a bit off. They're a bit too orangey, like if they were sick with jaundice or something like that. So this is just a byproduct of messing around with camera calibration. And the final step to his edit is adding this warm cast into the entirety of the image, but in particular to the high end of the exposure, to the highlights. We have this very warm image, and in particular in the skies, we can see how the blues have been replaced with an orange. Then in the shadows, he adds a direct opposite in the color wheel, creating color contrast by adding this aqua or mint-like color. Some cases it's a bit more subtle, like in this image, and in other cases it's a lot more intense. It all depends on the situation and how much intensity he's adding. So right here we can see how there's this color contrast with the teal that's appearing in the black and in the blues, but then it's creating the color contrast to the oranges in the skin, or exaggerated oranges in the skin. And this is done in color grading within Lightroom, previously known as split toning. So creators, I think I have all the information that I need to replicate his style. So today we're going to create two presets, one which is a bit more contrasty and saturated, another one which is a bit more soft and diffuse. So before we jump into Lightroom and start color grading, I'm going to remind you that these two presets are going to be added into the Edit Like preset pack V3. Link up here in case you want to check it out. In that preset pack, you're going to find all the presets that we've created in the Edit Like series throughout the season. And as I continue to analyze more styles, more presets are going to be added into the pack. So that's a great way to skip all my tutorials, and in the process, you can support me. Also, you can browse around my shop, link up here as well. You're going to find my personal LUTs, personal presets that I use every single day to edit in a faster and easier manner my photos and videos. So if you can support me in any manner, I'd be very thankful. If not, don't worry guys, let's jump into Lightroom. So creators, here in Lightroom, I've selected an image and I moved into the develop module of Lightroom Classic. And don't worry if you're using other versions of Lightroom, whether it be mobile or the desktop version, it's exactly the same process, the same tools, only the appearance is different. Now, the only tool that is not available in Lightroom Mobile is camera calibration, but we are going to use it today, so keep that in mind. Though I've selected this image in particular, not because it's exactly the same as the ones from Roldan, but we have the colors, we have the skin tones, we have the oranges, we have the blues in the background, and overall it's an even lit environment. If this image doesn't suffice, down here we have all these other images that we can use to corroborate if we did a good job with the preset. Remember, I'm not trying to replicate his photographs, I'm trying to replicate his color grading. So let's get on with it. First of all, let's create the more contrasty and saturated variant, and then we're going to move into the more faded one. Now, first of all, let's go with exposure and contrast using the basic corrections, highlights, shadows, whites and blacks, presence tab, and the tone curve, and then we're going to work way downwards into the color grading tools down here. So remember, first of all, we want a flatter exposure. We want to reduce the brightness in the highlights and achieve more information in the shadows without losing the punch in the blacks, but also we want to fade them out. So we're not going to use temperature, tint, exposure, and contrast. These four sliders, I like to leave them at 0 and not save them within the preset. So these are the four sliders that we use to maybe compensate anything that we didn't do on field. For example, this image originally, if we deactivate the exposure, is very underexposed because I'm a terrible photographer. I shot it at 100 ISO, 1/8000 of a second. So this image is underexposed, and I applied a 1.35 stops over here, but I don't want this 1.35 stops to be saved in the preset so it applies to any other image that maybe is correctly exposed. So these four values are at 0. So let's go into the highlights. Here, we don't want to pull them towards the positives, otherwise we attain overexposure in our bright spots on the image. Instead, we want to go towards the negatives, so we retain a bit more detail in the clouds or any bright part. So around the minus 25 is going to be enough. Shadows, I don't want to go towards the negatives, otherwise we introduce more contrast. I want to go towards the positives, so we have more information in dark parts of the image. Pay attention over here how we have little detail in the vested jacket over here. So if we go towards the positives, more detail starts to appear. Not too much, maybe around plus 50. Whites, I'm just going to leave it like that. I'm going to move them around in the tone curve. It's a bit more intuitive. But blacks, I am going to return them just a bit towards the negatives, around the minus 30, just to retain that contrast. So what we're doing right here is just bringing more information into the dark parts of the image with the shadows, but then returning a bit of the contrast with the blacks. Okay, next let's move down to the tone curve, and this tool can do basically the same things that we did in the basic corrections, but the interface is a bit different, and we can also change the channels or the RGBs over here, so we can even color grade with this tool, but it's a bit imprecise. So for this tutorial, I'm just going to concentrate in the point tone curve over here, not to be confused with the parametric tone curve that we have at the left. So what I'm interested in doing right here, first of all, is reducing a bit of the whites. This point over here will control the bright parts of our image. This point at the left will control the black point. So as you can see, if I move this point up, we reduce the amount of blacks in our image, and when towards the right, we introduce more dark and more contrast. So first of all, let's fade out the blacks. The blacks weren't completely black in the example images. As we can see right here, we have pure black. Let's fade it out as if we had a diffusion filter. So if I put it up, notice how the blacks start to change into this grayish tone. Of course, we don't want to overdo it, but maybe around the plus 16 is going to be enough. If you're not too sure where to put this point, you can always look at the values that I'm selecting over here. The input is the coordinate in the x-axis, and then the output is the vertical axis. So I moved it 0 on the horizontal, 16 on the vertical towards the positives. So right here, our blacks are faded out. Next, this point will control the whites. I'm just going to drag it a bit down so we don't have any pure whites on our image. I don't want to go too low, otherwise our image is completely flat. But if you guys want to go this route, go ahead. In this case, I'm just going to be a bit more conservative. Maybe around the 239 is going to be the value. And here we have an image which is looking quite nice. The problem is that we're losing a lot of contrast, and we're creating the contrasty version of his style. So what I'm going to do is create a point here in the region of the shadows. I'm just going to pose it just in the middle of the diagonal. There, I'm going to put it in the input 30, output 30, just in the center of the diagonal, just retaining a bit of the shadows over here. So right here, our image is looking a bit too contrasty, but don't worry, we still have to go into the presence tab over here. Now in the presence tab, what we're trying to do is mimic a bit of the effects of the diffusion filter. So we're going to bring the contrast a bit down, but also we're going to bring the sharpness. So a diffusion filter just reduces the amount of sharpness in your image, and it diffracts the light so the highlights are a bit bloomed out. So for example, right here I have 1/4 of diffusion. If I take it away, notice how my skin has changed, notice how the contrast has changed, and notice the lights in the background. And now pay attention, if I slide on the diffusion filter once again, you can see the change, how it creates this mist-like effect, more grayish effect in the video. So I'm just going to place it back. So I'm trying to replicate this look on this photo that wasn't shot with the diffusion filter screwed on. So first of all, I'm just going to reduce a bit of the texture. If I go towards the positives, I introduce more texture, more sharpness, which isn't what we want. We want to bring that digital sharpness down. I'm just going to go around the minus 15 is going to be enough. Clarity introduces more contrast into the mid-tones. We don't want to go towards the positives. Again, towards the negatives around the minus 15, just making the image a tad more soft. And then the haze will create a similar effect to the diffusion filter. So towards the positives, we introduce more contrast, more clarity. Towards the left, we introduce this halation type effect, not 100% accurate, but it's similar. So I'm not going to go too low, otherwise this image is completely strange. But again, around the minus 12 is just going to be enough. So right here, we just created a softer image. With Y on our keyboard, we can see the before and after. And this is before. We have a very sharp image. Now it's a bit softer, but we have the exposure as we wanted. Look at the difference in the sky. The skyline is a bit more well preserved. The shadows and the blacks are a bit more faded out, and we have more detail right there. Okay, so that's it for the exposure and contrast. Now let's move down to color grading. Now, first of all, let's move into camera calibration, which by default in Lightroom Classic is all the way at the bottom. And this tool is supremely powerful because it allows us to change the basic nature of the colors on our image, the color science commonly known. So we can change right here the green, the red, and the blue primaries, which will compose the exposure of every single pixel that we're looking at. So right here with this tool, you can basically change your photos that look like it was shot on Sony to make them look like it was shot on Canon, Nikon, Fuji, vice versa. So this tool is supremely powerful, but in this case, we're not going to use it to correct, we're going to use it for creative purposes. So first of all, red primary will alter most of the reds. So I'm not going to go towards the negatives in the hue. Otherwise, we obtain more magentas, more purples, which isn't what we want. We want to go towards the positives. So we have an orangey look. Now, I'm not going to go too high. Otherwise, the oranges change a bit more towards the yellows, towards the greenish tones. So I'm just going to go towards the positives a bit, around the 28. And then the saturation would add more red into these tones. So if I add more intensity right here, these colors will be accentuated and they basically start to glow just a bit. So not too high, obviously this is way too much, but maybe around the plus 11, just gonna be enough. Very subtle. I don't want to go too ham with this tool, otherwise we're changing and creating very dramatic effects. So right here, our orange is starting to be highlighted just a bit, but they're a bit more towards the greener side, towards the yellows. The skin tones are a bit strange. So what I'm gonna do is move the blue primary to add a bit more orange. Yes, you heard me right. I'm gonna move the blue primary to work with oranges. Why? Because camera calibration works with complementary colors or color contrast. If we move up to color grading over here, you can pay attention to a global color wheel, and you can see that the blues are direct opposites with the oranges and the yellows. In other words, the complementary color of the blue is the yellow. So the way that I like to visualize camera calibration is that you have a ball, and if you pull one side, which is the blues, you're also affecting the direct opposite in the same direction, which is the yellow. So if you play around with the greens, you're going to play around with the magentas as well. So you always have to keep that in mind with camera calibration, that you're not only affecting a single color. So back to camera calibration, we're going to add a bit more orange into the skin tones. So I'm not going to go towards the positives, otherwise I introduce more greens and more purples. Instead, I'm going to go towards the negatives just a bit. And notice immediately how the skin changes a bit more towards the oranges. Now, this is way too much. So I'm just going to go a bit towards the negatives, not too much, maybe around minus 16. There, the skin tones are a bit more orangey like we saw in Roldan's images. And then the saturation, here you guys can play around. I would suggest a value around the 20%, something around these lines. And notice how the oranges have really popped in our image, also the blues, but we're going to desaturate them further along. Or you can play around all the way to the plus 50s if you want more of a dramatic effect. Now for this preset, I'm going to leave it at plus 50 because this is the more saturated and contrasty version. But for other cases, maybe you want to go back into camera calibration and bring down the saturation over here if the skin tones are way too extreme for you. It all depends on the color of the skin. Okay, so we can see what camera calibration has done. This is before. This is a very natural looking image, and after we can see immediately how the blues, how the oranges have lit up, and they're basically carrying the entirety of the colors of the image. Okay, next up, let's move up to HSL because we have some colors that are not present in his feed. For example, the blues in the background, we want to desaturate them completely in the water and also in the sky. So I'm gonna move up to HSL. Well, it's not known as HSL anymore, but color mixer. Down here we do have HSL. We're going to change the hue and saturation of specific tones. So for example, first of all, we're not going to touch the magentas, reds and oranges because those sliders will control most of the skin tones of all humanity. And we already work quite hard so we can achieve the orangey jaundice type skin tones that he has on his feed. So these three, I'm not going to move them. I am going to move yellow. Why? Because yellow will control a lot of the greens in the background or in the trees or in the grass, in particular the lighter greens. In this case, we don't have any greens in this image, bar this little dot over here, which isn't worth editing, but we are going to just drag it towards not the cooler tones, but more towards the warmer tones, just a bit. So maybe around the minus 24 is going to be enough, or 25. Then the greens will control the darker greens, the more emerald-like greens. Again, not towards the cooler tones, towards the negatives. Again, around the minus 25, 27s is going to be enough. Aquas, we don't want them towards the darker blues. We want to bring them more towards the mint-like colors, just to corroborate what we're going to do further along with the color contrast. Around the minus 45, and I'm going to do the same with the blues, minus 45 as well. It's not very evident, but we changed some of the colors that are going to be appearing in other types of photos. Next, in saturation. Here in saturation, first of all, what I want to do is change the saturation on the blues. We want to bring them almost towards the complete negative, always towards the minus 100. Around the minus 95 is going to be enough. And as you can see now, our sky and the lagoon in the background are completely desaturated. And also the blues that were appearing in the blacks are also gone. Don't worry, we're going to fill that void further along in color grading. Then purples, we don't see any purples in his images. Again, to the -100, it's going to be enough. Aquas, I'm going to leave it like that because in aquas, we're going to see all that mint or that teal look that we're looking for. So I'm just going to leave it with the normal saturation. But the greens, I'm just going to bring them down around those -45, and also the yellows in case we have any greens in our image. Okay, so as we can see, if we deactivate color mixer, this is before and after, and right here we're basically desaturating some of the tones which aren't very useful in his editing style. Next up, we're going to fill that desaturation with the color of our choice in color grading. So color grading is down here, previously known as split toning, and it's a very simple tool. Basically, we have these color wheels. Each one controls a different part on our exposure, shadows, midtones, highlights, or the global color wheel over here. And we can basically assign a saturation with a hue into a specific part of the image. So right here, shadows, we want to add that teal look. Then in the highlights, we want to add the warmer look, and also in the global color wheel. First of all, with the highlights, this will affect all the skies or any bright spots on our image. We can add some saturation over here, and then just find the color that we want to work with. We can go with more of an orangey type color over here, but I would suggest maybe something like this, more of an yellowish type or goldish type color. Obviously the saturation, this is way too extreme. Just going to drag it down around these values. I'm going to go with the hue of 52, saturation of 27. And then in the shadows, we're going to create color contrast using a color which is opposite in the color wheel. So I'm just going to add some saturation over here. And we don't want darker blues or cobalt blues over here. We don't want anything too green, maybe something in the middle. Maybe around these values, you guys can play around. I'm going to go with a hue of 190, and the saturation, I'm going to drag it to the 17 is going to be enough, or maybe even a bit higher around the 22, having that this is the more saturated version of the preset. As you can see, if I deactivate this wheel over here, this is before and after. Everything in the shadows is a bit towards the greener side. It's very evident right here in the jacket of this dude over here. This is before and after. Now everything has this teal look in the shadows, in particular the blues in the background. And finally, what I'm going to do is just cover the entirety of the image with a bit of a warmer look. So I'm just going to use the same hue that we did over here in the highlight. Just going to right click, copy settings, and then I'm going to go to the global color wheel, which will paint the entirety of the image with a certain color, and paste the settings. But of course the saturation is way too much. I'm just going to drag it all the way around this 5 to 7% is going to be just enough, because right here I'm painting all the image. And in the highlights, we're basically doubling down in the color, but in the shadows, it's very interesting because we're mixing this hue, this warm hue, with the cold hue that we have in the shadows. And now we have this very nice looking teal color in any dark part of the image. We can deactivate color grading to see before. This is before and after, and now we have that color contrast, those saturated oranges, very warm, and then the cool tones in the mint light colors in the shadows. Okay, so we can see the before and after of our edit, and this is the before, a very natural looking image, contrasty, punchy, and now we have this flat looking image. It's a bit darker, a bit more dim. We have that contrast, but we have those colors that we were looking for. Overall, the greenish cast, the warmish cast in the image, and those very saturated and highlighted oranges in the skins in particular. So I think we did quite a good job. Let's save the preset and then apply it to other images to see if we need to modify it or something that we didn't do quite as well. So I'm going to go to the left panel over here to save the preset. On the presets, select the plus sign, create preset, and right here we're going to name it, and then we don't want to mark any of the values that we didn't use. For example, we didn't use any grain or post-crop vignetting, so we're not going to mark effects. And also I want to unmark white balance, exposure, and contrast, because these are the values that will depend on the images. So I'm just going to save it. So let's see how the preset performs in this image of these ladies in Seville. Let's apply the preset over here, and immediately you can see the shift is quite dramatic. We have those greens now in the background. We have those orangey skin tones, and we can obviously play around with the amount slider over here. If the effect is too strong, we can go towards the negatives just to reduce the intensity just a bit, or towards the positives to add more color. Now, of course, you can obviously play around just a bit with the exposure, just brighten it up, or reduce a bit of the contrast or add more contrast if you wish. Let's see how it performs in this image. I'm quite interested in seeing how the reds are shifted, and also how the shadows transition into the green tone, in particular in these types of situations we have bright spots and then the gradient towards the darker tone. So let's apply the preset. As you can see, I've already added it into the Edit preset pack. So let's apply Roldan Gilbuena. And there we have it, and it looks fantastic actually. We have those greens in the shadows, we have those orangey tones in the truck, and it's looking very nice. Notice how the exposure is very dim in comparison to without the preset. We're just lowering a bit of the exposure, just making it a bit more dramatic, a bit more filmic. Over here in this image of this photographer that I met in Dubrovnik, a bit more professional than I, but let's apply the preset and it looks fantastic in my eyes. We can see the big difference over here in the skin tones, more towards the oranges. Notice how the oranges in the background really start to pop a lot more. And then we have that teal look replacing the blues in the shadows, and it's just looking very nice. Okay, so I think the saturated and contrasty preset is quite nice. Now let's create the variant on it, but don't worry, we don't have to start from scratch. We're going to use the same preset as a base and just modify a few sliders to create the softer and more diffused variant. So here I'm back in my original photo, and the first thing I'm going to do is just eliminate this point in the tone curve that will control the contrast and the shadows. Just going to right click, delete control point, and immediately you notice how the image is a lot brighter. Now, this is way too much. What I'm going to do is just drag a bit of the whites more towards the negative so we have a flatter looking exposure, all the way down to the output setting of 212. Then what I'm going to do is just the dehaze, just drag it a bit more towards the negatives to add more halation or simulated halation to -20. And finally, the skin tones are a bit too saturated for my taste for this preset. So I'm just going to go all the way down into camera calibration, and the 50 that we added in the blue primary in the saturation, I'm just going to reduce it to the 20. So it's not too much of a saturated effect in the yellows and in the oranges over here. So as you can see, if we compare it to the original photo, it's a lot less contrasty, a lot more flat. So let's save this preset and see how it performs in other situations. Okay, so we have this random image, but it's quite cinematic. I don't know why I took it, but let's correct a bit of the exposure. Just bring it up, and then let's apply the presets. First of all, let's apply the contrasty version, and it's looking very cinematic. The only thing that I was missing is just maybe to crop it in a 21:9 aspect ratio. And this could be a shot from a thriller movie or criminal movie, but it's looking quite nice. Now, in this case, as you can see, the skin tones are suffering just a bit because just of the color of the skin of the person. So what I would do in situations like this is maybe reduce a bit of saturation of the blue primary right here, so it's not too harsh of an effect. Now let's apply the soft version of the preset, Roldan Gilbuena Soft. And as you can see, this one works better with the skin tones of this model, a bit more of a lighter version of the preset, not too contrasty, not too saturation. I think it looks quite nice. Back to the image of these ladies in Seville. Now let's apply, first of all, the original preset, the more contrasty and saturation, very dramatic. I really like this preset, very intense. And now let's apply the soft version, a bit more laid back, a bit more soft, and a bit brighter, which really works with female models, a bit more of a brighter environment, not too dramatic and contrasty, and the skin tones work perfectly with the softer variant. How about over here in this image of what I would consider to be Jose Mourinho playing the piano in Venice? So let's apply the presets. First of all, Roldan Gilbuena, the base one, and it's looking fantastic, this preset in this image. It brought down a lot of the overexposure that we had because of this white curtain over here. We have those orangey skin tones, that teal look in the shadows. It's looking fantastic. Obviously, again, you can play around with the intensity slider over here if you want a softer or more intense look. Now let's apply the softer version, which is soft again, a bit less contrasty, a bit more faded, and it works quite well. A bit different, but it works quite well. So there you have it, guys, my interpretation on Roldan Gilbuena's color grading. I hope you received some knowledge out of this video on how Lightroom works and how to break down styles. And remember that these two presets that we created are in the Edit Like Preset Pack V3 and also the Edit Like LUT Pack V3. So I've reconverted these presets into LUTs so you can apply them into your video as well. Link up here to my shop in case you want to support me. If you can support me purchasing anything from there, I'd be very thankful. And that's a great way to ensure that I can continue to do videos for you guys, because we all know that YouTube AdSense pays next to nothing, in particular in Mexico over here. So if you can support me, I'd be very thankful. If not, just like the video, share it with a friend. That also helps me out. I'm Tony Fuentes. Cheers to all of you, and I'll see you in the next one.